So in this video, we're going to talk about three different cytokines that can be produced by macrophages upon recognition of an infection and their local effects. Cytokines are signaling molecules. They allow one cell to communicate with another cell somewhere else. Now, that signaling can be local, happen locally within a tissue, or it can be systemic. Those signals can get into the bloodstream and travel far away from the infection. In this video, we're going to talk about local um, responses to infection, local action of cytokines. So here's an example here where the macrophage is in a tissue. Macrophages are resident, they live in tissues. And let's say there's some tissue damage. Let's say there's a pathogen, and that pathogen is recognized using the macrophage's toll-like receptors. And remember, there are toll-like receptors on the surface of macrophages, internally in vesicles. Either way, when macrophages are binding to molecules that are either produced by the pathogen or on the surface of the pathogen, that's going to trigger a response from the macrophage. The macrophage will turn on certain genes and produce certain proteins called cytokines often. And those cytokines are going to have an effect to help the immune response. So right now we're talking about a local effect. We'll get to systemic effect in a later video. So here I've drawn a blood vessel. And then now let's introduce some actual names of cytokines. So here I've drawn out IL-1 beta and TNF-alpha. For the immune system, you really have to know your Greek letters. So there's a beta and an alpha there. So what are these proteins called? What do these proteins do? So we have their interleukin 1 beta. So IL, you'll find we're going to learn a lot of interleukins in immunology. Interleukin refers to these proteins, right, that were originally identified that allow immune cells to talk to one another. So interleukin leukocytes. So IL-1 beta, so that's the first cytokine that we're going to talk about. It's a cytokine, right? And like we said, that when one cell wants to talk to another cell, it releases these proteins, these small soluble proteins. What are they going to do? Well, often, if a protein is signaling to another cell, it's got to bind on the other cell. The other cell has to recognize it. So here I've drawn a blood vessel. And if you recall, the cells that line blood vessel walls are endothelial cells. On their surface are IL-1 beta receptors, and I've drawn IL-1 beta binding to the IL-1 beta receptor. So now the macrophage is communicating with the endothelial cells of blood vessels. Now, what is going to happen to the blood vessel? Triggers a change in the blood vessel structure so that the blood vessels dilate, vasodilation. So what is that going to do? Well, when blood vessels dilate, that increases blood flow, right? It brings more blood, brings more immune cells, brings more immune protein to the tissue site, to the infected site. It also triggers an increase in vascular permeability. We covered this in an earlier video on inflammation, right? This is an inflammatory response. When the tight junctions between endothelial cells is not so tight anymore, then those gaps can allow fluid, immune cells, immune proteins to leave the blood and enter the tissues, right? So now what do we have going on? We've got inflammation going on, and it's being triggered by cytokines such as IL-1 beta and TNF-alpha. They can both trigger this effect on blood vessels. This is again happening locally within the infected tissue. So this is good, right? We're bringing in fluids that have immune system proteins in there, like complement is in there. We're hopefully maybe flushing the pathogen into the lymphatic system, right? Edema. We've got some swelling going on here. There are immune cells in the circulatory system that we would love to attract to this site. So there's a neutrophil and a monocyte I've drawn there. So these cytokines, when they bind to their receptor on the surface of endothelial cells, the endothelial cells, they're doing all sorts of changes. Another change that happens on endothelial cells is they turn on, activate proteins on their surface called adhesion molecule proteins, right? So, what are adhesion molecule proteins? They're proteins that allow other proteins to bind with a higher affinity. So, proteins on the surface of neutrophils and monocytes will actually bind to these adhesion molecules. So, instead of just swimming by in the circulatory system, the neutrophils and the monocytes will actually stick to the walls of these blood vessels that are being signaled by inflammation. And now, what are those immune cells going to do? We're going to want to track them into this infected site. Right? Remember, there's an infection here. The whole goal of this systemic effect on the blood vessel is to bring in immune system cells, proteins, fluids, inflame the site so we can clear the infection and repair the tissue. There's another cytokine that becomes released by macrophages in response to an infection called CXCL8. It was our third cytokine that we're going to learn about. CXCL8, it's a cytokine, special kind of cytokine called a chemokine, also known as a chemoattractant, right? So it is a cytokine that, when released, will actually attract cells, such as neutrophils. So neutrophils have a CXCL8 receptor on their surface, and neutrophils will migrate toward high concentrations of CXCL8. So again, it is a chemoattractant. And so now neutrophils have infiltrated the inflamed site. Why is the site inflamed? Because of these cytokines. Where did these cytokines come from? The macrophage recognized the infection using toll-like receptors, produced a series of cytokines, which are causing changes in the blood vessel, right? So we have increased vascular permeability, vasodilation. We're bringing more blood, more immune cells. We got inflammation going on. And so all those characteristics of inflammation we talked about, um, tumor, swelling, we got the fluid, we got rubor, redness, more blood for vasodilation. We got calor because blood brings heat, but also another cytokine called IL-6, interleukin 6, is also released by macrophages, and that acts locally on fat cells and muscle cells that might be in the area. They have IL-6 receptors on their surface, and when IL-6 binds IL-6 receptors on fat and muscle cells, it increases their metabolism to generate heat. So now we've got calor, we've got heat from the blood, heat from muscle and fat cells generating heat, and this heat tends to impair pathogens from replicating. So pathogens do not like it hot. Immune cells do like it hot. So we have now calor from the heat, and that's another characteristic of inflammation. So all of these effects, all of these local effects, are triggered by cytokines, and these are just some examples of cytokines. There are many more, and these are some examples of targets of these cytokines. These cytokines can go other places and do other things. These are just a couple examples that you should be aware of.